walnut desk legs, but with a secret. Now, 2 of these legs, of course, different ones, needed an access panel to be able to reach in and plug in the cord for this power outlet that will be recessed in the live edge slab desktops. But these legs are curved, so it was a little tricky and I had to get creative. So for this one, a little copper pole.
It's not what it looks like.
And some magnets. And for this one, a little finger pole. Dude, can you turn the heat on? It's like a meat locker in here. Grain matched. Now, in the main build video that will come out next week, I'll go into full detail on the desk builds as a whole. But for this video, I really wanted to dive into the details on these legs. And of course, the monumental underestimation of time I thought they would take, the things I might do differently next time, and of course, the never-ending problems that always seem to find me. So let's grab some walnut, and I'll show you how I made these legs.
I just wanted to know how it felt.
Let's go in there. Now here's a little more insight into why I'm building 2 desks. Now my client owns an investment business, importing, exporting, something. But he's also a podcaster. Now his office will be divided by a giant glass wall. On one half, he will record his podcast at one of these new desks, and at the other end will be his personal desk. And because of the current electrical configuration in the floor, that is why one desk needs an access panel in one leg and the other desk needs it in a completely different leg. Now, even though these legs are just over 28 inches tall and they don't look like they would use that much material, it took almost 100 board feet of walnut to make them. Now, I did have some waste with those pesky live edges and the sapwood, but I also had a lot more waste on those round legs than I thought I would. Ripping all those thin strips releases a lot of tension and uncovers a lot of gremlins in walnut. So I ended up with quite a few canoes, bananas, and snow skis, a lot more than I expected that went in the burn pile. And by the way, that's just a starter stack of how much walnut I needed. Now, once I had that kind of broken down, I went over to the bandsaw and ripped off all those live edges and sapwood, because who wants that? Not me. Then I could get one flat face on all of these on the jointer, and then flip them over and get a parallel flat face with the thickness planer. Ah, the joy of milling. Okay, so these are the acoustic soundproofing panels that will be placed all over this podcast room. You can see the profile here. It's got a little bevel, 45 degrees on each side, and a flat top. Now, I want to mimic this profile on the leg all the way around. But the problem is I need to figure out how many of these slats I need to cut. Because once this thing wraps around, there's 2 things that could happen. It could come up short and leave a gap, or they'll be too long and they'll overlap. Actually, there's a third option. We get it exactly right. So how do we do that? So I did a little math right here. So if we have 1.25 inch slat times 39 slats, it gives us 48.75 circumference all the way around, which gives us a hair over 15.5 inch diameter. Now you may be saying, that's not 16. But we also need to take into account the thickness of the slat, which is a 1/2 inch all the way around. So that adds 1 inch to that final measurement. So we're actually over at 16.5. So instead, if we knock that down to 38 slats, that gives us 47.5 circumference and 15.125, which is 15.1/8 diameter. Add 1 inch to that for 1/2 inch on each side, and we're 16.1/8. We're pretty much there. All right, so I'm gonna head over to the bandsaw and start ripping all these strips down. Then we'll plane them to thickness, and then we'll start putting that angle on all the sides. This should be fun. Now, unfortunately, the material I had wasn't thick enough for me to yield 3 pieces out of each. Now, I needed them to ultimately be a 1/2 inch thick, but after they're resawn and then flattened again, I wasn't able to yield as many pieces out of these blanks as I had anticipated. Henceforth, therefore, I needed a lot more material than I thought for these slats. I mean, just look at those stacks of walnut. Now, of course, some of them are for the oval legs, but a lot of it is for the slats as well. I honestly didn't really know where to begin with all my glue up, so I figured I'd start on the big oval legs first, since those were the most material intensive and the heaviest. So I used the domino to cut some mortises and then I could get these things slathered with glue, some dominoes in there, and get some clamps on them. Now, since I'm making 2 of these flattened oval legs, each one needed 2 big panel glue ups, one for each side. And at that point, I had had enough walnut, enough glue, enough clamps, and I let those sit overnight. And the next day, I could get those out of the clamps and start the next phase of glue ups with these legs. Now, since these legs aren't going to be completely solid, because that would be just kind of a waste of material, there will be ribs in between. I'm actually pre-finishing on the inside, because you really don't want to finish one side and not the other. It could cause cupping because the material is going to absorb and release moisture at different rates throughout its lifetime, which could cause cracking and warping and cupping and just downright wood malfeasance and sadness. And I just used some Zinsser shellac because it dries so fast. I was able to get a few coats on there, and then I could get to gluing on these little ribs in between. Now, I'm using screws because I can't really get clamps in the middle, but screw length and placement are very important here. Since these legs are going to be shaped rounded or ovaled, you don't want to put any on the outsides, so that's why I'm just using clamps there. The middle of the leg is where it's going to remain the beefiest, and I know I won't hit those screws when I'm shaping them. My goodness, that's a lot of clamps. Now, once those ribs had pretty much set, now I could complete the walnut sandwich and drop the other big panel on top, and needed a few clamps for this glue up. Well, all right, maybe more than a few. All right, maybe a lot. Oh, don't need that one. How about that? Now, for the leg with the access panel, I'm only gluing on the ribs right now, because at this point, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that access panel, and I didn't want to glue anything together and then, well, be totally f***ed. Okay, so I've been messing around with this for a while. This white outline is going to be the ultimate shape of the leg. But this side right here needs to have an access panel so that we can access the plug that's going to be coming out of the floor at the very bottom. So this gap here, which is about 1.5 inches, just isn't big enough. So I need to cut these back before I glue them up a little bit, kind of like that. That way I still maintain some structural integrity here and here where this joint is, but then it also opens up a lot more room in here to drop a plug down. But I also need to consider where my access panel is going to be. So before I make that bevel cut on the back, I am going to actually rip this into thirds, pull out that panel, glue these all back together, and then make my bevel cuts on the back. That'll be much easier to do when everything is perfectly square, rather than if I make the bevel cut first and then I try to make all these rip cuts and glue back together. So a little disassembly and then over to the table saw. Now, if you've ever seen a small, maybe side table or hall table where it looks like the drawer front is integrated into the apron because the grain match is perfect, well, this is the exact same concept. So I rip it into thirds, and then I'll cross-cut that middle panel, which breaks out my actual access panel. And then you can see here, once all the pieces are cut and separated, a perfect grain match. And then it was time to glue it back together. So I used some tape just to mask off the areas where I didn't want any glue, and then a couple clamps should do it. Oh, well, maybe more than a couple. And while that was in the clamps, I could cut the back bevel on the other piece, and I believe this was about 5 degrees. So after I ran it through the bandsaw, it gave me a bit of a rough cut with that resaw blade, but smoothed it out on the joiner, no problem. And then the other panel was magically dry, so I pulled that out of the clamps and ran that through the joiner to get me one smooth face, and then through the planer to get the other smooth face. And then, the moment of truth. Does this thing still fit? Oh, mama. And then just using some tape from the outside, I taped that panel in place so it couldn't move, and then cut the back bevel on that piece as well. Then I taped it back in place and ran it over the joiner to get a perfectly smooth face. And I'm not gonna lie, I was a little nervous something could happen here, but it all worked out. Okay, now with these two pieces cut on the bandsaw, it doesn't look like that much more room, but when you slide a piece over here, that's what it would have looked like. And now we opened up all this space here, which is about 1 inch. So now down below in the floor, there'll be more room to access the outlet coming out. So the next challenge is the access door. Since it's loose, I still need to shape this leg with that in place. I also want to show you what I did with these filler pieces on the end. You can see here the grain is going this way, so that when I come around and cut this, you're going to have quarter sawn grain showing, which is nice. Same thing over here. As this cuts, you can see the grain is going to be outward. So I wanted to make sure I have quarter sawn or straight grain shown on the end too. So I turn this piece so the grain is going this way. So now with the access panel figured out and my back bevels cut, I could get this last leg assembled and glued. Unfortunately, since I couldn't use screws on these outer ribs, it was a multi-step process again, clamping that, letting that dry a little bit, and then I could put my final access panel in place with some glue and some dominoes and quite a few clamps yet again. Okay, I'm gonna spare you all the milling that had to happen to get all these 1¼ by 1/2 inch thick strips. As you can see, there's a whole bushel of them, but I ran them through the planer to get them down to that final width of 1¼ inch, make sure they're all even. Then I could head over to the router table, where I have mounted a 45-degree chamfering bit from Bits and Bits. Notice I have double feather boards on the top and on the side, making sure I have nice even pressure down on the table and against the fence. And this is going to take each piece 4 passes. The first pass is the roughing pass to clear away the majority of the material, and then the last pass is that cleanup pass to get rid of any tear out or any marks left by the router bit and get it as smooth as possible and leave me as little sanding as possible. And this was kind of a production train, just using the piece behind it to tailgate the piece in front of it and push it forward so my hands didn't need to be anywhere near that router bit. And then I could store them all neatly in the trash can while I build a form for gluing them up. Now I could grab some plywood and build a big old jig for gluing up these flexible round legs. Now this jig is pretty much identical to if you were gluing up a panel for a tambour door or a roll-top desk. The key is to make sure it is square and to use spacers all along the middle as you're gluing up the top and bottom rail to make sure everything is perfectly even across. Once that was made, I could cut all of my strips to that exact height. Did this with a table saw sled and a stop block. And then I could just start placing them in and organizing them and double check. Oh, that one's out. A lot of these tended to cup and bow after they were milled up and routed on the router table. It was pretty darn frustrating. Look at that pile of waste. Now, I had not really figured that, and I ended up with literally the exact amount to make the 2 panels I needed. It was a little too close for comfort. And once the strips for panel 1 were in the jig, I could then sand them all, at least the top face, but for the angles, I made this little jig with a 45-degree kind of point on the top and sandpaper wrapped around it, and that actually worked out pretty well, get in all those grooves. However, so the only thing left to do on these is to actually sand those square edges. So I started sanding each edge one by one, and then the light bulb went off and realized, oh, if you just turn them all on edge, you can sand them all at the same time. Now, before I could glue these to the canvas back, which would allow the whole thing to be flexible and wrap around my base, I needed to pre-finish the front faces and the edges because that would be really difficult once these were all glued up and flat. I needed to pre-finish them. So I'm using Fitty's Hard Wax Oil. This is actually the first time I've used this, and it applied rather easily. It tacked up pretty quick. I was only able to get about 10 strips done before I needed to wipe off the excess. As compared to Osmo and Rubio, which what I use the most, I'm not sure of the durability of this product. I have found Rubio to be the most durable, so only time will tell on this one. Okay, before I glue down my canvas backing, I just want to get all my pieces arranged in a pleasing looking color. Now they're all different color-wise, but I don't want all the same color in a row and then all the same color. So just kind of a mix and match to make it look a little bit more random. Now the other issue to address is the backs of these pieces. Some of them had some kind of overspill of oil when I was wiping off the excess. That needs to be taken off. We don't want anything that is going to interfere with the glue adhesion when we glue that canvas backing down. I think what I'm going to do is run a couple test pieces through the planer and see what that gives me as far as any marking. You look like a good test piece. Yeah. All right, you can see like a little burnish there and right there. To be honest, third coat of Fitty's right on top of that will mask it all. Then I could flip all my pieces over one by one and get them organized in the jig and ready for glue up. Now for my end kind of clamping caul piece, you can see I made some slotted holes. What that allows me to do is to get this set in there first and clamped, and since those screw holes are slotted, that edge guide is allowed to move until I get everything nice and tight, and then I can drive those screws home. Just use a little mallet to make sure everything is nice and flush, and then I can remove the clamps. Uh-oh, earthquake. No problem, we can fix that with the mallet. Oh gosh. Okay, maybe it was a little too tight. So I went back in and loosened everything and tightened everything back so it was nice and flat. Now I'm just masking off an area around the border where I don't want the canvas to go and I don't want any glue to go. And now I can lay out my canvas. This is just black duck canvas from Joann Fabrics. Basic stuff. Pretty standard, I think, for a tambour type door. And then I'm just using some Titebond 3 wood glue. Now, I've used contact cement in the past, but man, that stuff is so toxic and noxious, it'll knock you out. And I've used PVA glue in the past and had great success with it. The problem is this fabric soaks it up like crazy. I went through almost a half a gallon of glue between the two desk legs. And once the canvas was done, then I could start spreading it on the wooden slats, which as you can see, I needed 2 coats because it soaked it up so much. Now, this was the part that it's a little difficult by yourself. Getting this fabric to drape on there without any wrinkles or folds. So once I got it on there, I'm just working out any air bubbles. That's a fast cap speed roller, which is great for this type of application. And then I'm just using a heated iron to get some heat in there and then rubbing out those air bubbles as well, making sure everything stays nice and flat. Now I'll let this sit in the jig overnight and let that glue really take hold. Now this project has been a bit of a headache so far, and the cost of materials, well, it's not making it any easier based on how much walnut I thought I was going to need and how much I'm actually going to use. That's a lot of walnut. And unfortunately, lumber prices still haven't come down back to pre-COVID levels, so my pricing for this job was a little off, and I didn't take enough of an upfront deposit to cover it all. Now, typically, I could dip into my savings or investments to make up the difference, but there's one problem. The stock market just wrapped its worst year since the 2008 crisis. And Bank of America is warning that it could flatline this year. Flatline! Add in the collapse of multiple banks in the last week, and it's clear that the market's demanding a much more active approach. But Masterworks has already been helping over 650,000 people take control, including some of you. They've been featured in financial publications like Business Insider and Financial Times, and recently awarded one of LinkedIn's top 50 startups. And from Masterworks' office in downtown Manhattan, their team delivered tens of millions in returns last year by revolutionizing investing in contemporary art. I'm talking Banksy, Picasso, Warhol, real paintings. Now initially, I was skeptical, but contemporary art's appreciation has even outpaced the S&P 500 for the last 26 years straight. 26 years. And Masterworks doesn't do tokens or digital assets. You're investing in real physical paintings qualified with the SEC. They filed over 200 paintings with the SEC, ranging from $500,000 to $20 million. And while many have been panic selling or dip buying, Masterworks paid out over $25 million last year. That includes 3 sales just in the last 90 days, which returned 10, 13, and 35% net of fees to their investors. Now, of course, fine art isn't going to be your entire strategy, but with all this volatility in the market, it's a good reminder about why people diversify their investments in the first place. Now, I haven't found a better way to enter the art market than Masterworks. And it makes sense why their paintings can sell out in days, even hours. Now, Masterworks has given me a priority access link, which I've left in the description below, so you guys will definitely want to check them out at masterworks.art/Keith Johnson. And thank you, Masterworks, for sponsoring this video. And after some solid sack time, the next day I could get into the shop bright and early and peel off that canvas border that was on top of that green tape and expose that fresh wood underneath. And in retrospect, I'll be honest, I don't think I really needed to do this. I guess I just had a tambour door in mind where you want the top and bottom section free of fabric so it can glide in your channel, but I don't think it was really necessary to do that here. And this was kind of the moment of truth for me, people. Getting this out of the form and make sure it actually bends into a circle and make sure that none of that glue stuck together in those individual slats. Luckily, they were pre-finished, so it couldn't really stick, but there was a little glue that squeezed through, so I'm just making sure I break all that. And now we can raise it up, and would you look at that? It bends, and we have a circle. Now, I did repeat this exact same process for the other desk leg. All right, moment of truth. And that little template there was laser cut by my buddy Pete at Petree's Workshop and laid out in Illustrator by my friend Beth. Let's see how these fit around our template, or don't fit. All right, that comes up about 1/4 of an inch short. That's a shame. Let's try the other one. They should be exactly the same. But you never know. Boy, that one comes up almost a little bit shorter, like 3/16. Now we did all the math. Length, figured the circumference, what the diameter should be. The problem is there's a couple variables going on here. We have the thickness of the fabric behind, which to be honest, I didn't take into account. You also have the back of these strips. They're perfectly flat, so they're not fitting flush and even all the way around the template. So we're gonna have to do a modification to this. Hopefully, I'm gonna do the first modification to what is showing up as the bigger gap, and then hopefully we can get it to work over here. Whether I have to just take a pass or two with a hand plane on these strips where they meet, not a big deal, but I'd really rather not make 2 templates. So then with a circle jig in my router, I made a new template 1/8 of an inch less in diameter than the other template. So let's see how this fits. Oh, well, hello there, beautiful. Okay, just realized something here. When I was fitting this, you can see there's no canvas on the top and there's none on the bottom either, which is where I was fitting this wrap to the template. Unfortunately, that doesn't take into account the thickness of the fabric all the way around, because there will be discs going all the way up. And when I wrap this where there's canvas all the way around, woohoo! You may not be able to see that, but that's 1/4 inch shy. So, this template needs to be smaller. Right, buddy? Yeah, you screwed up. Time to make a new template and check it again. So I just screwed that template down to the bench and made a light pass all the way around, making this just a little bit smaller. And now we can check it again. All right, how many of you think it'll fit? Well, if you said yes, you were right. Thumbs up. Now I can make my master template that I will use to flush trim all the other rings going up the center of the circle. And as you can see, I cut out the center of that, so now I have a ring or a life preserver to put my template on and mark them out. Now I'm using a Sharpie here because unfortunately these little notches weren't exactly equally spaced. So if I went to assemble these and one was turned a little bit more than the other, it wouldn't line up. So this is just to help me with alignment. And at this point I realized, you know what? It's kind of silly for me to try to assemble these half lap joints from the inside of this ring, so I moved them all to the outside. So I extended all of my layout lines to the outside. Now, I needed a new template with all those notches cut. So I took my old one and cut a little piece off, screwed that down, and then routed out or flush trim, pattern bit, whatever you want to call that little notch. Actually, all 5 of them, all the way around. I used the bandsaw to clean out the majority of the waste first, and then a wrist cam in the house, and then I just used a flush trim bit to clean up the rest of that waste in there. And I did this on all 5 of those notches. And I know you're like, what are all these notches for? I don't get this. Well, it will all become much clearer once we start assembly. So here's my master template with the notches all cut in, and now I could just go and use my router jig and the router and start making some circles. I have my radius set to that inner circle first, so I'll make that cut on all of them and then change it to the outside and cut all of those the same. Now some of these I had roughed out with the jigsaw ahead of time. I made them oversized before I figured out exactly what my diameter needed to be with my template. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm flush trimming all of those to my new template. So just using a 1/2 inch flush trim bit here to plow through these, no problem. And then to get in those corners, I'm using a 1/4 inch flush trim bit. And then once you disassemble those, there they are. Perfect. 10 plywood rings. Now for my vertical supports, I am notching these to complete the half lap with those rings. So I'm just doing that with a dado stack on the table saw, ganging them all up at once. And then I'm going to attach these with pocket holes. That's right, pocket holes, people. Pocket holes and some epoxy, of course. But I'm using my little Craig jig here, which is super easy to get attached. And then drilling in those pocket holes. Total boat, baby. That's right. Then it was time to bust out the Thixo by Total Boat. I'm using this instead of wood glue because wood glue's running all over the place. And Thixo, well, it's thickened epoxy. So once I get my vertical stanchions all screwed in, then I could screw in the top. Now for the top of this one, since I don't need an access hole down through the bottom or the top, I'm just gluing in a solid disc. And then I'm gonna glue in some walnut blocks here, which will receive the recessed leg levelers. I use a little CA glue in the middle to give me that immediate bond so I don't need clamps, and then the PVA glue will give me that long-term hold. Then over at the router table, I'm just gonna flush trim those to match the radius of the circle, then flip that upside down and drill for my leg levelers. Now I'm drilling multiple holes, one for the radius of the leveler, one for the threaded insert, so they're nice and flush. Now these are 3/8 threaded inserts that will accept the 3/8 leg levelers. So with those holes all drilled out and the inserts installed, I can now apply some glue and install this bottom disc base thing to the inner leg structure. So with some glue and some screws, this thing is strong like bull. Now for the other round leg with the access panel, I needed to remove a section of one of these discs to be able to get your hand in there. So I removed that on the bandsaw, and then with pocket screws and epoxy, I did the same thing I did on the other leg to get this one assembled. Now at this point, I honestly didn't know how I was going to do this access door, but I figured it's probably best to have a little extra meat, top and bottom, to screw in or whatever I was going to do. So I cut out a couple pie slices from a scrap ring and screwed it in on the top and then down near the bottom. And of course, Jerry had to swoop in and take a sniff of glue and see exactly what was going on. And then the final step was to attach it to the bottom ring with the leg leveler blocks. Okay, another slight little issue here. We resized the template to fit the new size, and there must have been a lot of moisture kind of trapped in here from all that glue. I've been gone for a few days and came back, and when I wrap this, it will probably make it with some band clamps, but I don't want to have to stretch this thing in order for it to fit because it may shrink even more and then separate this. So there's about 1/8 of an inch gap there. I will just cut this right off. This will get glued on as it normally would, and then I'll take that bigger piece and glue that on separately. So with my trusty utility knife, I'll shave off that end piece and then get ready for glue up. But first, I need to trim this to length, top and bottom, get those little nubs off. And now it was more Thixo. So I basically lathered every open surface with this epoxy, and then like putting a jacket on a mannequin, I'll just wrap it around. And then these band clamps do a great job applying equal pressure all the way around on a cylinder like this. So with that first leg in the clamps, I had to do the same thing to the one with the access panel. So I'll trim off that end slat, and then I had made a piece that was a little bit wider, so I double checked the fit, and that looks good. Now, since I don't have enough band clamps to glue two of these legs up at the same time, I figured I would work on the access panel. And even though the inside of this leg is plywood, I thought maybe the door opening frame should be walnut, so it looks a little nicer. So I cut out a ring to my template with some walnut, and then I'm just going to glue that in place with some regular PVA and some CA glue. Do that top and bottom. That one I'll have to clamp, otherwise it'll probably fall. And then I just cut some side jams, basically, and glued those in place. Now the door needs to match the exact curve of the leg. So using some 3/4 inch material, I use double-sided tape to put that to my template and flush trim it. And I come up with 3 door ribs that look like that. Now, if you recall, I had mentioned the notches in my rings weren't exactly evenly spaced, so the angles are different. So I determined it was 37.5 on one side, 34.5 on the other, and I made those cuts on the table saw. Now it was time to cut the access door out of my walnut wrap. So I marked where I needed to make my cut, and then using a square, I carried that line all the way across, and then I'm going to use the Festool track saw. As you can see here, I have a stop on the back and a stop on the front. The one on the back is to make sure I don't get any kickback, and the one at the front stops the blade right there. That mark indicates where the blade ends when it's fully depressed. What do you think, Jerry? You ready? Yeah, me neither. So I really only had one chance to get this right. So I went nice and slow, kept monitoring where that blade was going to end. I couldn't go too far into the next slat, otherwise I'd have a repair to make. So I even screwed down the track to make sure it wouldn't move. So with that out of the way, I had to finish that cut up with a handsaw. As you can see, it started to fold down. That was a good sign that it was separated. Just get that last little notch there. Kind of break that off. We can clean that little nib up afterwards. Then using a utility knife, I'll just slice it off. And now we have an access panel door. Now, just to confirm the test fit. And by the way, I made a big mistake here. I should not have trimmed this panel to length before cutting that panel, because now the thickness of the kerf of the saw blade is going to give me a bigger gap than I wanted. However, when I split that kerf difference between the end of the leg and the panel and the other slats above it, it ended up working out okay. Now it was glue up time. So with my trusty Thixo, slather that on there and then wrap my panel around, some clamps, and then of course some band clamps and some more band clamps. It was all secure and I could breathe a little sigh of relief. And just like that, it was all dry, so I could take it out of the clamps and begin the next phase of this access panel door. Now, I had already cut my curved ribs for the access door, but I needed to cut my vertical pieces. So over at the miter saw, I do that, and then I can kind of dry fit this in place and see how it looks. Looks pretty good. Now let's glue it together. So I'll glue my verticals to the bottom and then secure them with screws. I made sure to pre-drill and countersink these holes before putting any screws in to avoid any splitting, because that would have been disastrous. Right, Lola? So I do the same thing top and bottom, securing with screws. Now, since the top and bottom rib are curved and this side pieces are not, I just take a block plane and gently massage it until it matches the curve of the top and bottom. Then with some screws, I'll secure in that middle rib, again making sure to pre-drill and countersink these. And now the backs of those side pieces needed to be planed down flush with all the ribs as well to give me a nice uniform flat surface. And now we can dry fit the whole door frame. Looks pretty good. Now to glue back in that replacement strip that we had to cut off. So this one is just a little bit wider. I believe it was about 1/8 of an inch. So with some epoxy, and I had already pre-finished this. So now it's just a matter of popping it in place to fill that gap. And then, of course, all the band clamps. And magically the next day, everything was dry. I could remove the clamps, and then... So I just had a great idea. Why not flip this leg upside down and have the access panel up top? It's a little easier to get to. It's not down at your feet. And then this little plywood edge, which I neglected and didn't cover it with walnut, is up underneath the desk. You won't really see it. And then it occurred to me that I had already put in the leg levelers and inserts and all that up here. So, and I'm gonna be thinking, because I may end up putting new levelers underneath, because I really like it this way. So it's gonna take extra time, but in the end, I think it'll make a better product. I always make more work for myself. And now for the next butt-clenching operation, that was to glue our little tambour-esque panel to the door frame. So I'm clamping that in place with a 0.5 millimeter gap at the top, and then I'm gonna do a 1 millimeter reveal at the bottom of the door. So with some Total Boat Thixo, I'm gonna lather that on there, spread it around with a paintbrush. Hopefully don't get too much squeeze out. And then I can place my panel on top, which should fit nicely in place. And you can see at the top, there's just that little bit of a gap, probably about 1/32 of an inch, because I didn't cut that access panel out before cutting the whole panel to length. But it was a bit fortuitous, because since this will be under the desk now, I'll need a little bit of room up there so it doesn't scrape the bottom of the desk. Now, while that was in the clamps, it was time to move on to the big flat pancake oval legs. So over at the table saw, I got my blade angled at about 13 degrees, I believe, to clean off as much waste as I can. Now, the problem is, once you cut one side off and you flip it around against the fence, it no longer has a flat reference surface. So things can get a little tippy and wobbly. So the best thing to do is to use some double-sided tape and glue on the piece that you just cut off. Now your flat reference surface has been restored, and you can glide it along the fence without any issues and make the cut on the other side. Now, before I can begin any shaping, I want to secure that access panel in place so it can be shaped at the same time as the rest of the leg. So I ran a piece of plywood from top to bottom, and now I'm screwing it in place, and then with some double-sided tape, I'll stick that panel down. Now, I was a little concerned that the double-sided tape would be so strong I wouldn't be able to get it out. So I put this little ribbon in there, which would hopefully allow me to help pull it out, kind of like batteries in a remote control. Some more double-sided tape. Then we could stick this thing down nice and flush and secure. Now, the first step is to shape the top and the bottom using our pattern. I'm using this massive 1-inch ultimate pattern bit from Bits and Bits to make my first pass all the way around. Then I can remove my template, lower the router bit, and make another pass, which just gives me less material to shape later. I do this at both ends of the leg, and then I can just throw it on the bench and connect the two ends. I'll start with the power planer to remove the bulk of the material. And then I can move on to the hand tools, just using a number 4 bench plane here to get down to my layout line, and then I can finish up with a random orbital sander. And I'm doing this with 80 grit. Later I'll come back with 100, 120, and up to 150. And then it was time to get that access panel out. So I unscrew the screws on my piece of plywood, and wouldn't you know it? Oh, it slides right out. Once in a while, something goes against plan, but in a good way. Then I could unstick it and test the fit. Well, I mean, I know it fits. It was just in there, but, you know, sometimes you just like to make sure. And there's no way I'm doing a that's what she said joke here. All right, now to figure out how to make this an actual functioning access panel. Magnets. Yeah, magnets. So I cut a couple of backer cleats or door stops and then drilled some holes in for some magnets. And then I could glue in some magnets, just using some CA glue here. These are 1/4 inch rare earth magnets. Now I made 2 door stops, one for the bottom and one for the top. So I put magnets in each of those. And then I'm just using some epoxy here because I had already pre-finished the inside of the leg with some shellac. So this will pretty much stick to anything. So just spread it around and then I can clamp it in place. And now to put some corresponding magnets in the actual door panel. So over at the drill press, I go through the same motion, drill some holes, and then back at the bench with some CA glue. Now, if you're using magnets on both sides of something like this, rather than a piece of metal on one and magnet on the other, you really need to double check and make sure the polarity of your magnets is correct. Because if you put in one upside down, it will not stick. I know this from experience, so I double checked everything and then popped them in. Now, to be able to pull off the access door, I'm putting a 1-inch finger pull at the top. So I'll drill that at the drill press, and then I'll use a 1/8 inch round over bit on each side of that hole, just so it's nice and soft to the touch and there's no sharp edges. And then a test fit. Whew. Now I'm filling in the ends of all these legs with some blocks because I'm going to need to put some leg levelers in there. Now I don't need to necessarily fill all of these, but I just cut a bunch of blocks and I just started filling them. Now the leg template I had made had the holes already marked out for where I needed to put for the leg levelers. Now these are 1 5/8 holes, but I only had an 1.5 inch bit. So I'm taking out the majority of the material using the Forstner bit, and then I'll come back with a router bit and make it a perfect 1 5/8 diameter. Now my pattern bit only goes so deep, so I need to remove my pattern, adjust the depth, and then go down to the full depth needed. Now I also needed to drill a 2-step hole, one with a larger diameter so the nut at the bottom of the leg leveler can go down below, and then one for the threaded insert. And then I could install the threaded inserts. All right, so this fits good, but because it's so thick, when you try to pull it out, it kind of catches on that back edge a little bit. So I'm just gonna plane that down a little bit and round it over. So then it should pull out a lot easier. So with a spoke shave and a block plane, kind of got this thing worked down and followed the contour of that curve I had drawn on there. And then finished it up with a little sandpaper, make it nice and smooth. And then we could test fit its functionality. Ooh, that works nice. Now back to the other access panel. So now to figure out exactly what kind of finger pull here. Now, it would be great to be able to hinge this thing out like this. Unfortunately, this wall is at an angle, this frame is at an angle, and there's just no room to get a hinge in there. It's just a bizarre setup. And you can't really mount a hinge in this little strip here. Now, if I ever make one of these again, rather than putting 5 vertical supports in, I would put 4 directly across from each other, and I would make sure that these walls were square, and then I could hinge this out. It would be a lot cooler if it did. It'd be a lot cooler if it did. But again, this isn't going to be used on a daily basis, maybe a yearly basis. So trying to keep it simple. So I'm starting with some 1/8 inch thick copper bar stock. Just putting some yellow masking tape on there so I can see my layout lines, which I'll do with this flexible curve. And then over at the portable metal bandsaw, I'll cut that shape and the square end at the miter saw. And then over to the spindle sander to clear up all those edges. Now this was the tricky part. I only had one chance to get this right. I needed to cut a groove down the middle of that slat. So I set up a guide rail on one side, almost like a crown stop on a miter saw, and then I used a magnet to make sure I didn't make too deep of a cut going forward. Once that saw blade had died down, then I could back it off. And then I just cleaned up and squared up this groove with a combination of a router plane and a chisel. And then the test fit. All right, I wanted to give this pull a brushed look rather than a really high, shiny polish. So using a straight edge, I'm just drawing this across. I went through 150, 180, 220, and up to 320 paper. Now using a straight edge like this ensures your scratch pattern is parallel to your bottom face and not all over the place. So as you can see there, nice and straight and even. And then Mohawk makes some spray lacquer specifically for brass and copper. So I'll put a few coats on there. I masked off where I'm going to be epoxying it into the door. But before I do that, I want to get all my magnets installed in my door frame and the door itself. So again, just using some 1/4 inch rare earth magnets and some CA glue in there. I'll attach these top and bottom. And as you can see, I painted, or rather used some India ink to dye stain those plywood edges so it blends a little bit better with the walnut. And then with the door itself held at somewhat of a precarious angle, I was able to drill the holes for the magnets there, and then I could glue those in place as well. And then using some more Total Boat Thick Sew, which I actually tinted with some black pigment in case I do have any squeeze out that sneaks under my masking tape, it'll be black and not clear. So then I could just glue in this little copper pole, clamp it down, and we'll let that sit overnight. And while that was drying, I figured I'd make myself useful and put a couple of coats of finish on the interior frame and the top of those slats and just clean this all up nice and get it finished. And since I was in the finishing mood, I figured I'd put the first coat of Rubio Monocoat on the legs here. Now, yes, I did use Fitties on the slats, but I'm going back to my old tried and true using Rubio Monocoat Walnut on these pancake oval legs. Then I could do the same thing to the access panel, and off camera, I put a coat of finish on everything else. All the other legs, every nook and cranny, even this little access panel door after the glue was dry and I had removed the masking tape.
All right, as you can see, there are only 2 desk legs left, the round one with the access panel and an oval one with no access panel. You see, the other 2 legs were installed the other day with their live edge top for the podcast desk. Here's a little sneak preview of that. So in next week's video, I'll cover the full build process with the live edge slab tops, getting those flattened and shaped, installing the recessed outlets in the top of the desks, which was possibly the most delicate and scary operation of anything in these builds. We'll pour some epoxy and, oh, I'm gonna be building a drawer for the office desk. And I may even hand cut some dovetails. Or maybe I'll use the shaper origin. Well, tune in next week to find out. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. What are you doing over there? We're filming.